So welcome everyone to the first edition of the Deep Dive. My name is Hanno Burmester and I'm curator and host of this format. The Deep Dive is something special. It's a format where we talk about societal transformation in a very deep way. And the Deep Dive has three characteristics. So it's a radical format, that's the first thing. Because we go deep and we talk about deep interventions into our society's DNA, our political institutions, our economy, and also our paradigms. The deep dive also is fair. So this will be about an hour, sometimes less, sometimes more. But our guests always have the opportunity to actually lay out their arguments. They have time to develop something which is more complex than in usual TV talks. And also the deep dive is uncut. So you will see the whole conversation from the beginning to the very end, which may sometimes come faster and sometimes come later. Our guest here today at the Cocreation.loft in Berlin is Tomas Björkman, and Tomas is somehow a / personality. You're physicist / founder of a foundation / writer and philosopher / public speaker / entrepreneur, banker, etc. So you have various roles and personalities, and I think we could spend around 2 hours, 4 hours, maybe even a day in exploring all that. But I invited you today to talk with me about something which may sound abstract in the first moment. We will be talking about the development of consciousness in society, and I welcome you here. Tomas, thank you that you came.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, especially that we are here at the Cocreation.loft, because I have been part of the creation of the Cocreation.loft, and I'm always very happy to come here and see how all the activities that are taking place here are developing between each time I'm here in Berlin.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. For those of you who are curious, the Cocreation.loft, you can see a little bit in our background. It's an initiative that started around 1.5 years ago in late 2016, and since then we developed a little hub of co-creators who are grouping around a purpose we will be talking about in a minute. And Tomas, I want to start by asking you, you founded a foundation in Sweden a couple of years ago, and I hope I pronounce it correctly. It's called the Ekskäret Foundation.
Yeah, that's correct. Ekskäret.
Ekskäret.
Which is of course Swedish, and which means the oak tree island. Okay. So it was actually started around the island, which is the main asset of the foundation, and where we have built a retreat center, a conference center, where we try to make a maximum use of nature as a catalyst, both for individual development processes, but also group processes, and invitational conferences, and a few other things.
Very cool. Did you figure how hard it would be for people who are not from Sweden to pronounce the name when you founded it?
I actually didn't expect that it would be internationally appreciated or used. So that was not part of the branding brief of my foundation. Right. Just joking.
I get it. So the purpose, I think you summarized in a very short sentence, and that's really the purpose of the foundation is to co-create a more conscious society. And now that may sound very lofty, very abstract to many people. So let's dive into that. Can you give us a dummy summary of what that means and why that is the purpose of the foundation?
I should say that is the purpose has developed and been clarified during the years, and we haven't been using this specific formulation of the purpose for more than 2 years. Okay. Originally we were talking about wanting to explore the connection between personal inner growth and development and societal change. We also have been talking about, and it's still our purpose, to contribute to a more both sustainable and flourishing both planet, but also society and also individuals. And really looking at how these 3 or even more systems, the individual, the society, and the ecosystem, how they are all interlinked and that in order to make them all flourish, we really need to understand all these three very important aspects for our human life on this planet.
Okay. So a very integral approach.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But a little bit, of course, then when we are talking about co-creating a more conscious society, it really emphasizes, it's a very short way to emphasize that. One is that we believe that the world is so rapidly developing right now, not the least technologically, that it would be very stupid to believe that anybody can have any sort of answer to these questions that we are facing as humanity right now. So we are very open for the co-creation of whatever wants to be born and what we need to understand and what we need to learn. So we are more a platform for curious exploration of these questions rather than providing given answers, of course. So that is the co-creation aspect. And then talking about a more conscious society, that sort of is our way to link the importance of our inner world, our mind or our consciousness, and the fact that that entity that we could call our mind, which is separate from our physical brain, which is sort of the content of our brain, that is actually something that can develop and is always developing from we are born until we become adults, but also as adults. So adult development and adult developmental psychology is very important to us. And we think that that holds a little bit a key to both the societal and ecological challenges that we face right now. So in order to solve these challenges, we need to grow our inner worlds as humans, but we also need to grow our organizational culture, our societal culture, for those also to become more conscious. And then hopefully this together can form a more conscious society. And a more conscious society would also be a society that would actually recognize the need for this process, and that would provide a support for this process to happen.
Super interesting and quite ambitious as a purpose, I have to say.
It is, but again, it is to provide a platform and a space for the co-creation and exploration of this. So it's more that we are setting a frame or an agenda, rather than believing that we would have neither the answers nor the resources to do this ourselves. It's more like starting a movement, and I think this movement is actually a little bit now catching on. And at least the last couple of years after Erdogan, Brexit, Trump, and a lot of those quite dramatic and shaking events, more and more people wake up to the fact that it might not just be possible to save this civilization with small incremental changes. It might even be that we need to have a big change in the system. And then I would add to that, and I don't remember exactly what clever thinker it was that said that if you, for example, if you have a factory and you tear down the factory, but you keep the mindset that built the factory originally, the only thing that will happen is that there will be a similar factory reborn. So I think it's a little bit now when we are looking at systems change, that yes, we need a fundamental and radical systems change, but if we keep the mindset, if we keep our old world view, we will only make a version of the same thing. So the real deep change will come when we will have a mind shift.
It's quite interesting you're saying that. The day before this recording, we spent together at a conference here in Berlin, the Democracy Conference. And I think what came up very often is the differentiation between the hardware we need when we change society and when we transform society. And then, of course, I mean, the aspect you pushed very strongly, the software we need, right? And we will dive into this a little later and talk about, you know, the consciousness of society, how we can develop it, and which role politics plays in all this. But I would like to stop here for a second and maybe rewind a little, okay? And ask about your life and really the impulses that made you start this foundation in the first place. And now I think it may be interesting for people to know you. You're son of farmers, I believe, and you studied physics.
My parents were not farmers. They were typical middle-class family in Sweden, but they never went to university, and almost all my grandparents were farmers in Sweden. And I grew up on a farm also, at least half the years in Sweden. I think that was very formative for me, and having very early this connection with nature.
Right.
So I have myself, and I didn't realize the importance perhaps back then at all, but later in life I noticed that when I have been able to connect to deeper layers in myself, which I have had difficulties doing. I mean, studying physics and being an investment banker and all of that. But when that happened, that was usually in nature, walking up in the Swedish mountains or in the Alps or sailing in the Stockholm archipelago. So out in nature, that has had a very good effect on sort of me being grounded. And that is why I wanted to create this center out in nature.
Okay.
So that's a bit my background. So yes, coming from a middle-class family, growing up on a farm, studying mathematics and physics, and then going into business.
Right. And that's interesting, right? Because you went into business, not only business, you went into banking, and basically you started investment banking in Sweden, if I remember correctly, right? Yes. So as a sector, it's not very well renowned, I would say, or it's infamous after 2008, the banking sector. And what is known is that the values in the banking sector and the values of the people who work there are certainly very different than the values of people who care about the consciousness of our society and work in NGOs and politics, etc. So I want to ask you maybe a first question for a very short answer, and then we will follow up. But could you describe your old banking life in 3 words and give us 3 words for your new current life?
I think first of all I would say that I don't think it is such a drastic difference between the banking world and the normal world. And certainly it's not that much difference. Certainly I have experienced inner growth. I'm older now, hopefully a little bit wiser than when I was 25 or 29 when I started my banking business originally. But there hasn't been any sort of completely drastical shift. And I would also say, not at all defending all the wrong things that certainly has always been going on in the banking industry, but also going on generally in business. I just think that the banking industry is or has always reflected the most extreme form of business in different ways. And if you go back not so long, if you just go back 50 years, 40 years, then of course the values that you associate with banking business was really the values in any sort of large corporate business. I mean, if you were General Motors or if you were Citibank, you were operating in the same paradigm, and it was a paradigm about efficiency and profit and perhaps short-term profit. And it might even have been that in the 60s this short-termness in profit, even in Citibank or General Motors, were not as expressed as it became to be after the neoliberal paradigm really took over our world after Reagan and Thatcher. Right. And then we really saw this Gordon Gekko capitalism. But I would say both in industry and certainly in banking.
Right.
And hopefully it's changing. Hopefully it is changing, and I see that certainly in the big industry today, that when new generations of students from the great business schools come out into the industry today, it's not enough to have a General Motors or a Citibank business card and offer you a good title and a good salary and bonus. now the most the top students from the top business schools, they demand more. They want to know what's the purpose of your organization and why should I work there? Yeah. So I hope that this is slowly changing also in my old industry.
Okay. I'm hoping for that as well. I'm not so optimistic, but
I think we come to that there needs to be some help. Because going back to the conference yesterday, I really liked your opening keynote, talking about the society and the market and the system as a game, and how we set the rules for the game. And I just think that for any industry, being manufacturing industry, service industry or banking industry, we shouldn't expect industry to do more than play by the rules. So we as society and politicians, we set up the game. And then it's hard to expect people not to play the game that we set up. Of course it's possible, and of course strong individuals decide to do it differently, but very much of the values in business is already built in the game.
Okay. I really want to go there. I think we should talk about, how the parameters society and politics define really predetermine how the economy acts in a way. We should be there in a couple of minutes. I still want to go back to you though, your journey.
Sure.
It's still remarkable that you're coming from an industry which is, as you said, very much short-term focused, right? Into a very different game now with the foundation, which is very much focused on the long term. Yeah. And you said...
And we actually have, I don't know if you're aware of that, but a little bit jokingly, but also seriously, we actually have officially a 100-year measuring period.
Oh, good.
For the foundation. We have in our statutes that we should put our very limited resources into the projects that we, to the best of our knowledge, believe will have the best return for society in 100 years.
Okay.
So in 100 years we will check, and then if we have succeeded we will pay ourselves a bonus.
Okay, when was that? When was that?
It was 10 years ago.
10 years ago, so I'm in 90, okay, I will be dead by then. Okay, but we'll see. But still, it's a drastic shift in focus from your side as well, right?
Sure.
And I really want to know, you said, okay, you matured, you've grown older, but I mean, what happened? Why did you change your life's focus and what you're devoting your lifetime and energy to so drastically? Can you give us a short story?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Coming out of university, I saw the world very much from a natural scientist's point of view, from an outside perspective. And that is also how I got into investment banking. It was basically through mathematical modeling of exotic instruments and helping institutions with modern portfolio management techniques, etc. But I very soon realized, being an entrepreneur, and apart from the banking business, I've started businesses both in IT and in property development, and some of them have been successful and some not successful. And having started perhaps 20 different businesses, some very small, of course, I started to think, well, why would some businesses work and why not others? And in the larger organization, in the bank, why are some managers much better at managing, and especially managing in rapidly changing times and with complex issues? Right. And I became a little bit, and I very early saw that it was very much in the hiring decisions that success was determined, but also that it was possible to help managers grow as managers.
Right.
And I became interested in leadership development and came to speak to about consultants and went through and had consultants work with our organization. And I from that started to realize that people can actually grow. You can be 45 and still continue to grow your mind, and you could do that quite drastically. You could do that quite drastically, And if you do that drastically, you become a better manager.
Right.
You can handle people, complex relationship, but also a more complex world better. You can hold the complexity.
That's still within the
better.
system, right?
Yeah.
But you got out.
Yeah.
You quit?
Yeah. One more thing. Another thing that is tying to what I'm doing now, what I also noticed in business, was that there in business, amongst business consultants and amongst business, that there is awareness about the importance of corporate culture.
Right.
So in a large business, the most important task for the board, many consultants would have told me when I was the chairman of the banking group in Sweden, is for the board to really make sure that you get the right corporate culture. If you get the right corporate culture, most things will sort itself out. If you got the wrong corporate culture, it doesn't matter what reorganizations. And we have recent examples. We have recent examples from here in Germany. We have the Volkswagen. I mean, that was probably sort of a corporate culture that made that possible. Another corporate culture that would not have happened. So in business, there is an awareness of the importance of this very intangible, soft thing, corporate culture, but still very important. But I see no such awareness yet when it comes to societal culture. Sort of the same aspect as in corporate culture in society. And that's really the most important task for the top leaders of a country would really be to focus on managing the societal culture. And then, of course, I'm not naive enough to think that that should be a monoculture like we had in Scandinavia in the 60s or 70s. It has to be a multiculture. But that good multiculture will not just happen miraculously by putting a lot of different cultures in one space, but you need to have some sort of holding environment that can make those cultures thrive together rather than trying to kill each other. So it was those things that got me very curious in our inner world and in cultural aspects and the soft aspects of both individual development and societal development. So really, when I got the opportunity, and frankly, I mean, it was simple for me to take this step, because when I sold my banking business and after I had to commit to serve as 5 years as chairman of the bank in Sweden and be on the board of directors of the bank in Switzerland. But when that contract ended in 2006, I was very happy to leave, and I had enough money not to have to work anymore. And then, of course, also you get to the question of purpose. As long as you need to work just to feed yourself and your family, then that is enough of a purpose. But if you don't need to do that any longer, what would then be the purpose of your life? And that might soon be a question that could be relevant for a lot more people. If we are moving into a society of abundance, and we might need to have a universal basic income, etc. So how do we handle such a situation?
Okay, so you're referring to the transformation of the labor market, the technological progress we're having these days, and the scenarios that millions of jobs will simply disappear because they're automated, right?
I certainly believe that will be the case.
Okay.
And I think there will be a very quick and hard wake up for a lot of people, organizations, and politicians. Already within 10 years, we will have seen a complete impact of the automation of administrative work. So in 10 years, we will have a completely different society. And if we don't prepare for that, that will be a complete turbulent shock.
And now that's really interesting, because especially in the northern countries like Germany, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, all these countries, we have a very Calvinist culture. People build their identity around work. So when they don't have a job anymore, society may fall apart very quickly because people lose identity and purpose somehow. And it's very interesting because what you're getting at with consciousness development and the co-creation of a more conscious society is a scenario where people have the ability to self-reflect and to basically navigate and change their identity in a changing environment, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what you did in a book which is called The Nordic Secret, I want to hold it into the camera. You published this year, I think.
6 months ago,
6 months
and
ago.
together with my co-author Lena Andersson,
Right.
who is a Danish philosopher and author.
Right.
Yes.
Who knows a lot about Germany? I think
Yes,
that's why you
actually,
came up with this word.
Yeah, and we learned a lot
Yeah.
during the 2 years of research that we did. It was a fantastic journey that we were on.
So the story you're telling in this book is quite interesting because basically you're describing how the Nordic countries, especially Denmark and Sweden,
Also Norway.
and also Norway, mastered the transformation from a pre-modern, agrarian, feudalist society into modern society, which was democratic, very much focused on education, industrialization, etc. And what you suggest is that we can learn from this experience when it comes to how we master the transition we're in right now, right?
Yeah.
From the postmodern phase into whatever comes next.
Yeah.
So, how so? Can you give us the gist of the book?
Yeah. First of all, I must again stress that this transition into a new society will be even, that we're just now seeing the start of, will be even more dramatic than when we went as Nordic countries from being dirt poor. I mean, people were starving in Sweden at the end of the 1800s. And up to 20% of the working population in Sweden was emigrating to the US because of miserable living conditions.
Right.
And then just a few decades later, even before the Second World War, we were the stable democracy industrialized, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So I think that we can learn a lot from that transition, and that the next transition is not something that will happen to our children or our grandchildren.
Right.
It will happen while we are still alive.
It's happening now.
The beginning is now.
Yeah.
But we don't recognize the pain yet. But I certainly believe that all these things that we are seeing right now, we already referred to Erdogan, Brexit, and Trump, but climate change, migration, psychological ill health, all of these crises, I think is just expressions of one underlying meta-crisis. And that meta-crisis is that we have reached a point now where our current societal software, you were referring to, our software, also our understanding of ourselves and of society and of the planet, that software and understanding has reached its end, and that something completely new needs to be born. Just like happened last time when we went from feudal societies into modernity. The only thing we should remember is that we are not on autopilot here. We have so many tendencies and forces that could instead make this just collapse, go into a fragmentation. So we go even more Erdogan, Brexit, Trump, that road, rather than sort of transitioning into what I would then call a more conscious society. So that's really the metaphor for the more conscious society. You could say it's more complex society, you could say it's more interconnected society, you could say it's a society that releases more of our human potential and freedom. You can express it in many ways, but saying that it's a more conscious society really points to the fact that it has also something to do with our inside.
Okay, it's interesting because I think we can pause here for a short while, because what you do is basically you say, okay guys, this doesn't need to be a downhill road, right? This can go right if we do it right. And there is something we can learn from history which may help us to co-create a process which actually works, which does not end in collapse and disaster, which is the usual historical curve, right? That you usually have a total collapse and then you rebuild from there with the learnings you gathered. So what is it we can learn from the shift that happened in the Nordic countries? How did they manage this transition so quickly?
Yeah, no, it's quite extraordinary what happened there, and it's actually not commonly known even in the Nordic countries. That's why we call it the Nordic secret. And that is the fact that 150 years ago in the Nordic countries, in all the Nordic countries, we had very visionary leaders, intellectuals and politicians that knew that in turbulent transition times, and they realized that the societies were going through, that the Industrial Revolution had already gone much longer in England and on the continent, and we were really on the outskirts, but it was coming here now. Yeah. So they knew that in such turbulent times, people usually, it's very human, we tend to search for some sort of fixed point or authority outside ourselves. Something to hold on to, something to put our trust in.
Yeah, the strong leader.
A strong leader, or religion, or something like that. But these leaders, they were so firmly committed to building democracy, and they knew that the only way to build truly stable democracies is to build them from bottom up. And that is why they wanted to empower a large part of the population to become active co-creators of democracy. But in order for people to be able to do that, they realized that they would first have to be able to become enough comfortable with themselves and to find their own inner compass and find a direction. Because again, in these turbulent times, it's difficult to give a direction, and you need everyone to be able to organize and orient yourself. And just like in a self-organizing organization, it puts much more demand on your mind and your consciousness to be able to do that, rather than just following orders. So in order to enable and to empower a large part of the population, they were actually all over the Nordic countries starting retreat centers for inner growth. Can you imagine that?
No, I can't.
Retreat centers for inner growth. And they did this really en masse. It started in Denmark, went on to Norway, and then to Sweden. Started somewhere in the middle of the 1800s, and by the turn of the last century, 1900, there were actually 100 retreat centers like this in Denmark, 75 in Norway, and 150 in Sweden, where young adults, without cost, could spend 6 months with the expressed purpose of not being politically indoctrinated, which would be the normal standard, but rather finding their inner compass and being what we today, or becoming what we today would call inner directed, rather than just looking at what do your peer group think and what does everybody else think, but really becoming inner directing, finding your inner compass. Developmental psychologists today would say that you become self-authoring. And that is something that can happen to you as adult. Usually happens late in life, but could happen earlier in life as well.
Okay, so what you're saying is if you give people the right spaces and offers, they can speed up the process
the inner maturation. The inner maturation.
And you're referring to Robert Keegan here, of course, right?
Yeah, for example. I mean, there are many psychologists, many also business coaches and theories around leadership development, because it's really from there that the focus has come, because industry has seen that this is an important thing in corporate managers and leaders, this inner development. So the theories about the stages that we go through in adulthood, or can go through in a positive maturation, there are many models for that, but the language of going from a socialized way of acting, where you are depending on external confirmation for your self-worth.
Is it right what I do?
Is it right what I do? To finding your own inner compass and becoming inner directed. Professor Keegan calls that you become self-authoring. Because you become really author of yourself, of your own life, in a much deeper sense.
So what you're saying is, and that's what you write in the book, that basically a critical number of people, I think you said 10%, went to one of these retreat centers.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. I mean, at the height, and we write that in the book, that at the height of this, say 100 years ago, more or less exactly from today, up to 10% of each young generation actually went to these 6 months retreats to be able to become self-authoring, find your inner compass, or at least start that process.
Right, and that's what you're saying. That's what happened when they were in these retreat centers, that they basically mastered to climb another step, right? When it comes to their own maturing process.
Yeah.
And now to many people it may seem that 10% is not so much, but we know from system theory that around 2% are enough to basically change the dynamics in a social system, right? So if 2% change their position, something happens.
Yeah, yeah. And even if there wasn't any, there were no tests for you to come to these retreats. They were called folk high schools, we should say, because some people recognize that today, and they still exist all over Scandinavia, even though after the Second World War they lost the focus there on personal inner growth and building democracy, because we reverted back to a much more mechanistic view of our mind as a rational machine, and democracy was anyhow more or less taken for granted back then.
So skills.
Yeah, skills, or so today you go there for just adult education or training. A lot of art as well, and it's very good. Yeah. But this core starting point with inner maturation to be co-creators of a new society, that is a little bit lost. Okay. But 10% did, and I would say it was probably a very, shall we call it, perhaps even entrepreneurial group that went there, because you needed to take a bit of an initiative. It was free of charge. It was mainly young people from the working or the farming part of the population, but still you needed to have a bit of go to do it. So probably it was not just any 10%. It was 10% that both before but also given this super start in life went on to become active co-creators. They could go into workers' unions, they could become entrepreneurial farmers, or they could even start businesses or other things.
So active drivers of a changing society.
Yeah, exactly.
Somehow.
And that was really the purpose.
Yeah. Okay.
That was really the purpose, to create that sort of group of people who could do that. Not from the top down, but from the bottom up.
Okay. So we do know history does never really repeat itself. Do you think this could work today if we implemented retreat centers all over Europe? People can go there. Yeah. What would happen?
I think that the main thing we could learn is that in times of uncertainty and rapid change and transition, we need to enable to just keep democracy.
Right.
I would say that for us to be able to keep democracy live, then we need to realize that we all need support and inner growth to be able to hold that uncertainty and the turbulence, and not using our gut reflex of grasping for this external help that will give the simple answers to the complex questions, but rather to hold the complexity ourselves. And that is focusing on inner work.
Right.
Okay. I think inner work ideally takes place in a trusted environment, face-to-face, small groups, just like we are trying to do at our retreat center outside Stockholm, as we're trying to do here at the Cocreation.loft, creating a workspace where that can happen, or in a co-living space in central Stockholm. Yeah. But I also think that is a very expensive way of doing it. Yeah. And that we could use technology today. With the technology that we have today, that was not available 100 years ago.
So like a scalable approach to these things.
And a combination.
Okay.
Scale with technology, and then go deep in personal meetings. Right. You could do the personal meetings in the city every Tuesday evening, and then you might every 5 years go on a longer retreat somewhere else to really reboot your system and software.
Okay. So I think the argument is really interesting because what politics can and should do in these times is of course to redesign the institutions we have and to rewrite the rules we have. But even if they do that, nothing will really happen as long as society stays at the point where it's at now.
Yeah.
Right? So we need this inner dimension for people to catch up with what is happening and just to keep pace somehow.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is related to our worldview and
Right.
this mind shift where we started. Because the interesting thing is that these visionary politicians and intellectuals in the Nordic country, they had a completely different worldview.
Yeah.
They had a worldview not of our mind as a rational machine, but as an organic growing system with lifelong development. And the interesting thing is that they got that worldview from the German idealist philosophers like Schiller and Goethe. That's why we have Schiller and Goethe on the cover of the book. They knew that our mind is not a machine. It's a complex system that is embedded in the totality of our bodies and embedded in culture. So embodied and embedded. And that this development can be supported. Now we have reverted back to the Enlightenment view.
Yeah, science.
And that is a view that has helped us as humanity to come here where we are today. Fantastic. I mean, we're not starving, we have cheap, we have affordable clothing, we have housing, we have modern medicine. All of that was enabled by this old Enlightenment, rational, scientific worldview. But now I also think that all the crises that we are seeing around us, or 90% of all crises we are seeing, are effects of that same worldview.
Right.
So I really think that in order, again, not to change the system into a similar system, we first need to change our worldview. We need a mind shift. And one of those mind shifts is going from this mechanistic view of our mind to a developmental picture. Another part is not looking upon ourselves as these isolated individuals that the economic theory today wants us to believe. And another thing is to really see the importance of culture and how societal culture, and the fact that we are really co-creating this socially constructed society, this collective imaginary that we are living in, where the democratic system and the market are expressions of that collective imaginary that is holding society together, but that we should be aware of that we collectively, democratically, are really the ones that decide on the rules of these games that we are playing. And we are not fully aware of the importance of those fundamental rules, and that we can change them and that we need to change them.
Yeah. I mean, super interesting. I think you touched upon a point which is really crucial here, and I think we have 15 minutes left, and maybe we can go into this during that time. So I think we have, this is uncut, we still do it. We have till 3:30. We're just talking to our team.
Yeah.
Okay. Right? We have,
sure.
Okay.
15 minutes.
Okay.
I'm fine.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
So, you touched upon a point which I find crucial, because on the one hand, the systems we created in the transition towards modernity created an abundance of wealth, public health on a very high level, even globally. There's a lot of material progress.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
At the same time,
I mentioned in my presentation yesterday that we are today really living in our grandparents' utopia.
Absolutely.
My grandparents, when they 100 years ago, when they were teenagers, they could not dream of this world that we have. It's a complete utopia, and that's not just for the Western world. 90% of people in the world today live in a standard that would be a utopia for my grandparents. So that's good.
And I think
so far so good.
Important to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But at the same time, of course, these gains undermine the fundament we stand on. Right?
Absolutely.
Because if we flip the coin, we see climate change, mass migration, global inequality, all these huge existential crises we face.
Yeah.
And what I find really interesting, and that comes actually in a book that is not out yet in English, only in Swedish. I read the English translation in the first version. The book is called The World We Create.
Yeah, well, the world we create, because
create.
It's really pointing out that we are the co-creators of many more aspects than we usually think we are.
Yeah, so that really fits, because what this book is really about, and I think that's the red thread, is self-organization.
Yeah.
And what you do is the first chapter starts with the self-creation of the universe. Yeah. Right? Yes. So it's a very humble
starting point, Big Bang. And I'm a physicist.
Yeah, absolutely. That's legitimate.
Yeah.
So, and then it's a really broad scope. It's a long journey up until to the point where we create the paradigm of the next society. Yeah. And now, of course, self-organization, yes, it's the driving force of all life. It's the driving force of all societies we have. Yeah. It's the driving force of our individual lives. Sure. At the same time, of course, self-organization is neither good or bad, right? It can be good and it can be bad. Yeah. And it really depends on the forces that steer it. Yeah. And what we see in the market today is that we have this kind of self-organization that basically self-destroys us.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the question is, and I think we touched upon that, but let's get a little deeper into this. Which kind of parameters, which kind of steering mechanisms do we need to steer societal self-organization into a direction which is more sustainable and more wholesome in a way?
Yeah. Can I pick up my other book here, my third book?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I want to take an example that I'm making in this book, and that's called The Market Myth. And this is the first book I wrote after leaving banking, and it's really my little bit inside perspective and thinking about the market as a self-organizing system. Right. Because the market is a self-organizing system, and Adam Smith was right in saying that there is an invisible hand that sorts out a lot of things in the market. Right. And self-organization is really nature's way of solving very complex organizational issues. And that is, of course, why the plan economy of the Soviet Union didn't survive, because it became a too complex issue. Self-organization takes care of that complexity. Right. But here is the important thing, and the point I'm really making in the book there, and it is a point that strangely is not really understood even at business schools today or university today, and that is that yes, the market is a self-organizing system, but compared to the natural self-organizing system, like the system that created life, for example, or the ecosystem, there we humans we can just accept that process. Right. It's steered by the replication mechanisms of DNA and other things. So it's a natural self-organizing system. Okay? The market is a socially constructed self-organizing system. Yeah. It's part of our collective imaginary. Even the free market could be completely different if we change the fundamental, the constitutive rules of the market. And what could that be? Well, we don't have a market at all if we don't have ownership. Right. Okay. Yeah. But ownership is not that just given. In the Stone Age, that might be a natural thing. I mean, okay, this is my stone axe because I made it and it's in my possession. Right. Okay. But now today, at least 80% of the economic value that we create today is created under some sort of immaterial property rights, like copyrights or patents and those things. And those are human decisions. What can we patent? Can we patent human genes, or should that not be possible? If we grant a patent, what do you need to do to get that? A patent is not a human right. Yeah. It's something that society gives to you and protects. Right. What do you give back? And it used to be that you had to disclose and give to public domain all the information. And those who created these property rights, they were very aware of the fact that they should be as short as possible. And that once you had earned a recent return, it was in everyone's interest that the knowledge fell in public domain as quick as possible and that could be reused. Now the tendency is that all these things like copyright rights and things just get longer and longer and longer and longer. And one should then be very, very clear that the way that we construct these constitutive rules of the market will make the market self-organize in a different way. So I a bit jokingly in the book talk about the two invisible hands of the market. One that bakes the cake and makes the cake as big as possible. And there we are all sitting on the same side of the table. We want to have a big cake. But then the other hand is the one dividing it. And the fundamental rules of the market would make this division different. And I'm not saying that we wouldn't need to regulate the market, but what I'm saying is that if we got the constitutive rules of the market right, then the self-organization of the market could be much, much both more just and also take the environment into consideration. We bring in the externalities into the equation in another way, so that what some economists call the pre-distribution of the market becomes as good as possible, and then we might need to do a small redistribution. Now we tend to do we ignore the fundamental rules of the market, and then we just believe that it's the redistribution that is. But those redistributions, I must say as an economist as well, the redistribution and the external regulation of the market will always make the market lose efficiency. So in some way we should have a minimum of them. So I'm a bit a market liberal person, but also really understanding that the market should look completely different from today, and also realizing that perhaps the most important things in life, our collective goods, can never be served by the market, and that you learn at university at the first Economy 101 course, but we tend to forget that.
Apparently so, Okay, but it's interesting what you're saying, because if people talk about the transformation of the economy, they tend to say, okay, we need to get rid of capitalism and its basic logic, and then they tend to fall back into the solution history offers, which would be socialism, communism, some kind of very strict regulation, right? So people react with regulation, but what you're saying is, it's fine, we need a playing field which is self-organized. The question is just how we design the playing field. Right? How it looks.
As you put it yesterday, how we design the game.
Right.
If we design a game that is where the aim is to have as many winners, has few winners and many losers. Okay, that might be a very efficient game. It might have been a cost that we had to pay to get this material standard we have today. But today we perhaps can afford to have a game that is more geared towards having many winners, much more win-win-win dynamic, and I would even question if that would be less efficient.
I agree.
I would even question that.
And who designs the new game? I mean, the question is also with regards to democracy, how do we come to the new constitutive rules of the next market, of the next society? Who designs them?
Well, the first thing you need to do, of course, is that you need to recognize the importance of these things. You need to recognize the importance of the constitutive rules of the market. We don't today. We don't understand this exactly.
We don't see them.
We don't see them. We don't see them. The second thing is that we need to see the market not as a natural system, something that God or nature created, but that it's a human system, and therefore that it is under our collective control.
But see, to interrupt you here, I think on the social democratic side in the whole of Europe, this has been seen since ever. But what they're doing is they want to regulate. They want to regulate within the existing frame. So in a way, they're a conservative force.
Absolutely. But I think that a little bit it might have been another thing before the 70s, but I certainly think that once the neoliberal narrative, the neoliberal economic model that we are living in today, really got a stronghold over all intellectuals and over all ideologies, then it has more or less been, we look at the market as the free market is some sort of evil, strong force that needs to be regulated from the outside. That has been the paradigm. What I'm saying is that even the free market could be different and certainly would need a regulation, but I would start by trying to design the market in a way that it provides a pre-distribution that is much more just and taking more into account. And of course, things like that have been done, like for example, trying to put a cost to environmental externalities, like the Kyoto Protocol and things like that. That's exactly in line with this, but it could be done much more systematically as well.
Yes. Okay. It would be interesting to follow up here, because I think now we come to the intersection of the future of democracy and who decides what the new rules of the game are, and the future of the market, the economy, and thus also the ecology. But we're running out of time. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing at the end here?
Yeah. I also have one more question.
Okay.
Go for it.
Because we today are so focused on the market, and we're also very focused on the political system. So we see the market and we see the political system. In the previous transitions that we've done in humanity, and of course the last huge transition was when we, at the Enlightenment, went from religious dogmatic society into the modern scientific rational society. In each such transition, it has not been so much totally rebuilding the dominating existing institutions. It has always been new things being born. Right. So just as in the Middle Ages, land was so totally dominant for any power or survival or any organization. All organization was built on dominance of land, and we call that the feudal society. Yeah. In industrial society, it became capital, and we have the markets. Land still today exists, and it's important, but it's sort of 2% of whatever, and then we have the market. It might be that we, in the future, it's 50 years from now, we still have the market. The market is helping us self-organizing, provide a lot of our abundant goods that we probably and hopefully could have then an abundance within planetary boundaries. It won't help us divide it, because the market is dependent on scarcity, not abundance. But that might be a small functioning thing, but it might just be marginal. Right. The new thing might be something completely different. Right. And what is that? Well, what is the new scarcity?
What is that?
And it might be purpose. But that might be another talk.
That's a good cliffhanger. This would be a nice ending point, but I still want to follow up with one question. What you're trying to do is you're kind of curating a network of change makers around you who are dealing with the question of what comes next, right? And how can we speed up a positive, productive process towards this next step? Yeah. What is your feeling? Is something materializing? Is something already in the process of shifting? Or is this something which is really just in its earliest beginnings? I would be curious to know that.
I think we're just in the earliest beginning. Okay. We see a lot of the bad effects of the old system not coping. I should also add that as with any, we didn't have time really to go into the self-organizing. That could also be another talk, because it's interesting to really understand how systems self-organize from the Big Bang all up to today, and how you have these emergent effects, and how the systems can either, when they come under pressure, collapse, fragment, or organize on a higher level. You can't force this, and you can't plan this. I think the key thing to have a successful transition into a more free, more global, more just society is, as with any, even the physical self-organizing system, what makes it possible to self-organize on a higher complexity level is if enough components in the system has an ability to function on that complexity level, to hold that complexity. And of course, in society, we're talking about people. So we need to have more people, not 100%, perhaps even 50%, perhaps the 10%, perhaps the 5%, that can actually hold the complexity of this new society that wants to be born. And that is that's when I'm talking about more conscious individuals and more conscious organizational cultures that can hold that. So I think the most important thing that we can do to help in this transition, to be a positive transition rather than a negative transition, is to help more and more people to be able that in their daily life to cope with complexity. And the only way to do that is through deep inner work.
Right. Deep inner work.
Deep inner work.
That's the last words. Thank you so much, Tomas, for being here.
Deep talks, deep work.
Deep talks, deep work. That was the first edition of the Deep Dive. My laughing guest was Tomas Björkman. Thank you for being here, Tomas.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.